say to those, okay, thank you. So just to say to everybody, thank you again for attending. This is yet another session. I've lost count which number we are now on of the HR bite-size sessions that we've been running over the last sort of 12 to 18 months possibly now. I'm Nikki Cockrell. My day job is an employment lawyer at Buckles. I'm joined this morning with Rebecca, who is also an employment lawyer at Leeds Day, and Claire, who is an employment lawyer at Price Bailey. I'm sure both of those will introduce themselves at the time. Thank you again to everybody for attending. Hopefully you'll find this session interesting. It is being recorded, as I think you will have heard, if you also had a little flash up sign that's come up in front of you as well. So if you don't want your faces to be recorded, then please just turn off your camera. In terms of questions, we're very happy to accept questions, but can I ask that you perhaps just pop them into the chat box? And what we're going to do this time around is we're actually going to get through our 3 sections, and then we'll take questions at the end. So please do pop them into the chat box. We're very happy to take them at the end of the session. We're also going to have a poll at the end of the session, because it's really super helpful if people can give a bit of feedback as to what the issues are that you're experiencing at the moment, what you actually want to hear about. We do try to do our sessions based on feedback and what members are looking for. So please do take the time to complete the poll. If there's anything that's not on the poll that you say, actually, I really want to hear about this, just drop us an email. We'll be very happy to obviously look at trying to work something out. So on that note, I'm just going to pass over to Becky, who's going to kick off the session, and she's going to be talking about changing terms and conditions of employment.
Hello, am I on yet? Oh. Hello. I'm Rebecca Ryan. You can probably see the screen rather than me, so that's quite good. So that just tells you who I am. I'm an employment solicitor at Leeds Day, and I'm going to be talking to you about changing terms and conditions. When we were putting this set together, we struggled a little bit to see what order to put things in, but we thought changing terms and conditions has more of a blanket appeal, so we're going with that first. So Zoe, if you don't mind just flicking over to that first slide. My slides aren't particularly detailed, as you'll see, so I'm planning to sort of talk to them more than anything. What I thought was a good thing to do first of all is to remind us about the types of terms, because we're going to change them. There are various different types of terms in an employment contract. You'll all know that there is an obligation on employers to provide employees with an employment contract when they start working with you, but the contract is made up of various different elements. So you've got the express terms. So what's an express term? That's what's written in the employment contract. You've also got implied terms, which can be implied in a couple of different ways. One, by statute. So the law basically adds certain elements into an employment contract through the purpose of statute. A lot of them will actually be reflected in what the express terms say, but some of them can be implied by statute. You've also got terms that can be implied by custom and practice. That one's thrown up a little bit of an interesting thing recently, because it's the way you typically work. It might say one thing, but actually you do something in a completely different way. The reason I'm thinking at the moment, so let's say most of our employment contracts probably say that we will work from a particular location. Mine says I work from the office. I haven't been for most of the last nearly 18 months or 20 months or so. So actually, but nobody's amended the terms in my employment contract, and I don't know of many clients who've amended the terms in their employees' employment contracts to say that they may now be working from somewhere else. I think at the moment, the fact that people are working from home has probably not changed by customer practice, because we're in quite extenuating circumstances. But as that continues, that could well be the case. So let's say you work in a particular location, but you 99% of the time work somewhere else. That could have been changed. That term could have been, there could be an implied term about where you work that's changed during customer practice. So they're the sort of terms that you'll typically get in an employment contract. There's also non-contractual ones. Really there, I'm talking about handbooks as much as anything else. So a lot of staff handbooks will be expressed to be non-contractual. So just a reminder of the types of terms that that all work together to encompass and govern the employment relationship. Next one. So I decided to break this section down into changing terms and conditions coming from different ways. First of all, if the request stems from the employee, so it's the employee that has asked to change their terms and conditions of employment. Now, Nikki's going to be talking to you about flexible working requests, and that's probably the way it will have come about in most circumstances. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail with that. But one thing I'm going to flag up for you initially is whether it's intended to be a permanent change. So unless expressed otherwise, a change will be a permanent change to those terms and conditions of employment. So if an employee has made a flexible working request or asked to change their hours and you have agreed to that, then you need to think about whether you want to try and factor in a trial period to that, whether you want to try and factor in a review, or if you want to try and say it's for a set period of time, because in the absence of anything else, it will be a permanent change to their terms and conditions of employment. Then you need to think about how you document it. I am personally not the biggest fan of issuing new employment contracts continuously. I tend to go along the way of a letter, so an amendment letter. Check the employment contract though to see if there is a specific way in which you need to vary the terms. Often it will say, if there's one in there, that it can only be varied in writing. That is the norm. You read, so you basically have a letter that says what the new terms are. Important to stipulate in there that it refers to the original contract. So this is the contract we're changing. These are the changes that we're going to be making. And it's usual to put a little catch-all at the bottom that says all other terms and conditions remain unaffected or unchanged. You then keep that with the original contract, and what it does is it operates to vary it. Good to get the employee to sign it so that you're both aware of what those changes are. There is nothing to stop you reissuing different employment contracts, you know, as and when you make changes. To be honest, it's certainly a matter of choice, but you do need to make sure that you document that change. Nikki, as I said, is going to be talking about the process of flexible working, and which is normally how a request from an employee will come about. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on when the request comes from the employer. So Zoe, if you can just flip that slide on, that'd be great. Because this is a little bit more complicated. So the employer wants to change an employee's terms and conditions. We're thinking that there's probably going to be quite a few of those on the back of the pandemic and the different circumstances we've had recently. A logical one could well be a location. The employer may wish employees to now work from different locations, home or otherwise. There may also be a need to try and change hours or pay if if a business is struggling or perhaps wants to look to change somebody's hours or pay as an alternative to redundancy or something like that. So if it's coming from the employer, as I said, it can be slightly harder. First thing to do is just to check the employment contract to see if there's any clauses on variation. Is there anything in the employment contract that says how you need to go about it if you want to make a change to the terms and conditions? Sometimes there will be provisions saying there will be changes, they will be made in this way, and you need to give a certain amount of notice. So that's number one, because that's your contractual position. But you also have to bear in mind that nobody can unilaterally change somebody's terms and conditions of employment. So you need to have consent of both parties in order to make a change. What I always say to my clients is, before you start the process, think about how far you're prepared to see it through. What will if you don't get consent? So let's say an employer wants to change the hours that people work. Actually, we've decided we're going to be opening an hour earlier. I now want everybody else to work an hour earlier. What if somebody if they agree, that's absolutely great. But if they don't, what are you going to do? There are ways of forcing it through, which we'll touch on, but they are not without risk. So before you start the process, think how committed you are to it, because you could end up in a situation where some members of staff agree and some don't. What are you going to do? And have people on different terms and conditions then. You also may have some resentment as well, because, well, I agreed because I thought I had no choice, yet actually so-and-so hasn't agreed. So think through about what you're going to do. First of all, are you prepared to go the full way to implement those changes? Is it that important to your business? Then you're looking at consultation. So consultation, the main force of that is trying to seek agreement basically. Talking to your staff about why you're looking to why you're looking to introduce this change, what the benefits are to the business, what the risks are, and see if you can get employees to agree to that change. If they do, absolutely fine. You then go back, you make the changes in the same way as you would have done before, by variation letter or anything like that. So you've got individual consultation. Depending on your numbers, you may have a slightly wider collective consultation obligations, but I think probably for the size of our businesses, we're looking at individual consultation. But also, and it's also important to engage with people on an individual basis so they know what it is you're trying to do. If you get agreement, absolutely great. You then record it, as you would before. What if you don't have an agreement? What if you've got a few members of staff who say, no, I'm not doing it. I don't want to do it. You can't make me. I have to have my agreement. You've got risk areas there, and you can force it through, but you have got risk areas there. So that the main risk is potentially being unfair dismissal, really. If you've got employees who've been out there for over 2 years, they will have unfair dismissal rights. You don't always need 2 years, though, as I'm sure many of you might well be aware. For discrimination and other elements, you don't actually need the 2 years service. So I'd always be mindful of that anyway. But the only real way of forcing it through is giving the employee notice of termination of employment. So actually, the terms on which we're giving you a notice your employment is going to end. You need to make sure that you give the appropriate contractual notice or statutory notice, which is statutory notice, as you know, one knows, a week for every year of service, up to a maximum of 12 weeks for 12 weeks for 12 years. So it's the greater of the two. You need to make sure you give sufficient notice of termination of employment. You've then, particularly if they've got over 2 years service, you've got potentially an unfair dismissal on your hands. You can attempt to find a fair reason for some other substantial reason, but it's you've got a real risk of unfair dismissal on your hands. But what you then do to try and mitigate that is you're offering them new terms. So because, as you may well know, an employee who wants to bring an unfair dismissal claim has a duty to mitigate their loss. So they get a basic award, which is similar to a statutory redundancy payment, but the majority of compensation is based on losses going forward, and an individual has a duty to mitigate that loss. So if you've offered them a new job with no break-in service or anything like that, on exactly the same money as they were on before, you just want them to work slightly different hours. Is it reasonable for them to refuse that job? It will depend partly on the circumstances. If it is reasonable, so for particular reasons they can't do, say, the additional start or something like that, but it may well help you mitigate your loss, for you to be able to argue the employee hasn't mitigated their loss, therefore I am not liable. Well, they might have an unfair dismissal claim, the value of it is not significant. And that's the real way of trying to force it through. So you're terminating their employment and offering re-engagement on substantively similar terms. The same would apply even if the pay is slightly different. Obviously, they can claim for the difference between, so if they were on £20,000 and the new job was on £18,000, they could have mitigated their loss up to £18,000, so the value of their claim is potentially the £2,000. That doesn't impact on the basic award though, so you would still be looking at possible cost of that, and obviously hassle of an unfair dismissal claim. But that is the practical way of trying to force through changes, which is why I do flag to clients, think about that at the end, because it's not without risk. So think ahead. This is the only way you will definitely get the outcome that you want. Are you prepared to go that far if needs be? On the only other thing I was going to flag with you is possibly any other alternatives. So is it actually a change of terms and conditions, or is it potentially redundancy? So is it potentially redundancy and re-engagement situation if the terms are significantly different, but potentially redundant? And I think that probably takes me through to the end of my slides. Yes, so it was quite quick. I think that was quite quick. That's the right timing wise. So Nikki is now going to deal with flexible working requests. Over to you, Nikki.
There we go. I was trying to unmute myself there. You can probably see the look of concentration on my face. As I say, Ollie's normally fantastic at stepping in for us. So awesome, thank you ever so much, and thank you very much, Becky. Hopefully that's useful. There's obviously an incredible amount really that is involved, and certainly risks associated with that course of action if you certainly if you don't get it right. So I'm going to be looking at flexible working requests, which we anticipate are likely to increase over the coming 6 to 12 months. Thank you ever so much, Zoe. So starting point is, which might seem blinking obvious, but who can actually make a request? So as I've stated on my slides, you have to be an employee. That employee needs to have at least 26 weeks of continuous employment at the date the request is made. And under the statutory scheme, which is what I'm going to be talking about in terms of flexible working requests, one request can be made in any 12-month period. As I say, this is in respect of the statutory scheme. Zoe, could you move on to the next slide? Thank you ever so much. So, when we're talking about changes, what changes can actually be applied for by an employee? So traditionally, when we talk about flexible working, businesses might automatically think that somebody wants to change to the hours which they work, but it actually extends far further than that. Employees may request to change to the hours they work, the times that they work, so maybe to start earlier, finish earlier, start later, maybe have a split or a longer break in the middle of the day, place which they work, which again, picking up on what Becky's said, this may be something that changes as well going forward. People are used to home working at the moment, so some people may have a desire to continue to home work maybe 100% of the time, but probably more realistic, a portion of the time. So these changes, it can also include things like annualised hours, compressed hours, flexi time, excuse me, hybrid working, job sharing, shift working. There's a whole host of changes that could be applied for. And again, this is talking about whether it's a permanent change or whether it is a temporary change. Zoe, could you, thank you ever so much. So how does an employee make a request? Now, there is some guidance in statute. And again, it may seem really obvious, but you do have to state the obvious sometimes in law. So in terms of flexible working requests, it does need to be made in writing. The request does need to be dated as to when it's actually been made. And that's important because there's a time period that starts to run that the employer has to deal with the request in, which I'll come on to. The employee has to state that it is an application made under the statutory procedure. The employee needs to specify what change is requested and when they wish the change to take effect. Again, may seem very obvious, but I have seen flexible working requests which has not given that detail. So we've had no idea what it is that you're wanting, apart from maybe more flexibility. What do you mean by that? The employee needs to explain the effect, if any, that the change would have on the employer. So the employee actually has to engage their brains, and they have to offer some assistance in terms of, well, how is this going to impact on the employer? So they have to think about it a little bit themselves. They have to state how any effect could be dealt with. So let's use, for example, somebody that wants to reduce their hours from 5 days a week down to maybe 3 days a week. So how could the effect be dealt with? The effect is that there's not going to be that extra body for 2 days a week. So maybe somebody else could be recruited to cover those couple of days, for example. And state whether they've made the any application previously, and if so, when. Because as I say, under the statutory scheme, the employee is only entitled to make a request once in every 12 months. Hopefully the employer would have details of when the last request was made, but nonetheless, there is a bit of an onus on the employee to be offering and engaging a little bit more than simply saying, I want to change. Now, in terms of how the request should be dealt with, well, obviously, if the request is received by the employer and it's all perfectly feasible, it's something which can be accommodated, then there isn't actually a need to have a meeting. The employer can simply confirm to the employee that the request is accepted. And then I'll come on to it in a later slide, but that would then involve changing the employee's contract, whether it be a contract, whether it be a letter. As I said, I'll come on to that shortly. Now, what What the requirement is that any request is dealt with in a reasonable manner. Now, there is no definition as to what a reasonable manner is, but obviously that's to avoid, again, I've seen this time and time again, whereby an employer receives flexible working request, and I'm not sure why it's not dealt with, whether they don't know how to deal with it, they mean to get round to dealing with it, I've no idea, but months and months can slip by, and that wouldn't be reasonable. As I say, employees need to be notified of the decision, so whether that's that it's accepted or whether that it's not accepted within a decision period. That decision period is 3 months from the request being made. That 3-month period also includes time for any appeal if necessary. My advice would be, once you get a flexible working request, then just deal with it. It can only be refused on one of 8 grounds, which I've listed in a later slide. And I would also just mention that you might want to consider a trial period. Again, I'll come on to that in a later slide. Thank you, Zoe. So as I said, when dealing with the request in a reasonable manner, there is no statutory definition as to what that means, but this is where ACAS have a code and guidance which may be quite useful. So in essence, that means arrange the meeting as soon as possible. It doesn't have to be the following day, but you know, as I say, don't leave it months at a time, which I have seen many times. Invite the employee to meetings. So as I say, if you're not sure if the request can be granted, whether you need to have a discussion about it, if it's a very simple case of yes, that's absolutely fine, you don't need to have a meeting, as I say. But if you want to discuss the request further, invite them to attend a meeting. You should put all of this obviously in writing to them, so a simple letter inviting them to attend. Right to be accompanied at that meeting, so trade union rep or work colleague. Discuss the request with them, explore what it is they're looking for. Often employers make assumptions as to why an employee wants a particular day off, etc. The reason doesn't actually really matter. An employee has the right to make this request, and the reason for that is actually of no relevance. But from your point of view, it might be relevant. I don't know, let's say that somebody's requesting Friday off because of childcare, and you absolutely can't have a Friday because, I don't know, it is one of our biggest order days. Well, actually have a conversation, because maybe that person just requested that because that fits in better with them, but actually they could have a Wednesday off instead because their mother or father is still around to be able to look after the baby. Explore what it is they are trying to achieve and why, because sometimes there is variation and you can actually reach a compromise with the employee. Again, it may seem really obvious, but as an employer, you should make sure that the employee is fully aware of what the impact of the change is going to be. Sometimes the employee doesn't fully appreciate the reduced hours will actually have an impact, not maybe just on their pay, but on holiday entitlement, the pension entitlement, any benefits. You don't have to go into great detail, and I certainly wouldn't advise that you do, in terms of sitting there and saying, right, well, if you work these days or these hours, this is what your pay is going to be, this is what your pension is going to be. But just make sure that, overall they are aware that there is going to be, therefore, a change, in the package which the employee receives. Now, again, if the request is approved, or even if it's not approved, it needs to be confirmed in writing. Again, it may seem very obvious, it doesn't always happen. You can communicate verbally as well, but do make sure that it is followed up in writing. And give a right to appeal if the request isn't going to be accepted. We'll just move on to talking about appeals briefly. So it may surprise you, or it may not surprise you, to know that actually in legislation there is no express right to appeal a request actually. However, the ACAS code suggests that a right of appeal should be given. It all goes down to it being the request being dealt with in a reasonable manner, and arguably if there's no right of appeal, there's an argument that it's not reasonable. There's no prescribed grounds because there's nothing in statute, so the appeal can be on the basis of the way that the employer has applied either the law, so the grounds which they've rejected the request, or the process that has been applied, or just quite simply, I don't like your decision, I would like you to reconsider it. I would just say that the appeal is an opportunity for, oh sorry, I can just go back, so thank you.
Right.
For the employer to review the request. So perhaps if you've got a different, because the appeal officer should really be somebody different to the person that considered the original request. And that person may come at it with new eyes. It's also an opportunity for the employee to question in detail why the request can't be facilitated. Again, a further opportunity for the two parties to have a discussion and see whether anything else could work for the business and also for them. And again, very obvious, but do confirm in writing again, regardless of whether you've done it orally, do confirm in writing again whether the appeal is upheld or whether it's rejected. And again, if it's rejected, just state again the ground. It may still be the same ground, it may be a different ground on which it's been rejected. Okay, so very briefly, we'll just have a chat about trial periods. Quite interesting trial periods. Again, legislation doesn't actually provide for a trial period with flexible working requests, but there is nothing that prevents the parties, if they're happy to agree a trial period, to agree one. ACAS Guide actually suggests using one where the employer isn't sure whether the arrangement is sustainable, because again, bear in mind, we're talking usually a permanent change, so for a long period of time, or whether they're not sure how it's going to impact on anybody else's flexible working requests. So trial periods can be quite useful. With a trial period, it's really important that you set out when it's starting and when it's ending. So don't simply say we'll agree it for, I don't know, a 2-month period or a 3-month period or whatever it is. You need to be very precise. Okay, well, we'll agree a variation from this date until this date. At this time, we're going to review it, and basically we don't guarantee that it's going to be accepted, in which case then you would revert back to your original, working arrangements. It shouldn't be any longer than is reasonably necessary to make an assessment. Now, I have had clients in the past that have wanted to do 6-month trial periods. I had one that wanted to do a couple of years worth of trial period. Now, that's not reasonable. Obviously, it will depend on your business, it will depend on the team, the resources, the actual nature of the work. So there's not going to be one trial period that necessarily fits everybody, and maybe not even fits every single team. But looking at your business, you need to make an assessment as to, well, how long is reasonable for somebody to trial these arrangements to see whether it works for us as a business predominantly. That's what we're bothered about, isn't it? Maybe for the employee, but actually it's employee wanting to change. So it's really us to see how it works for our business. And then at the end of that period of time, at the end of the trial period, do make sure that you confirm either way whether it's going to not the trial continue, but whether it's going to become a permanent change or whether it's not. Do make sure that you do that, because again, often it's these sort of technical details that actually just get forgotten, and then we're all left confused as to what the outcomes be, particularly if everything's been verbal. Okay. So, as I said, there's only 8 grounds that you can refuse a request. To be quite blunt about it, you can often find something to fit or shoehorn, perhaps, into one of these grounds. So, as I stated there, burden of additional costs, detrimental effect on the ability to meet customer demand, inability to reorganise work amongst existing staff, inability to recruit additional staff. So, maybe as we're going through these, you perhaps have in your mindset your own businesses. So burden of additional costs for a larger organisation, there's going to be less of an argument about burden of additional costs than perhaps a smaller organisation, or perhaps an organisation which is already on its knees. Inability to reorganise amongst existing staff, well, that also depends on the size of your business, the size of the team perhaps. Inability to recruit additional staff. I have had a client that's been in such a very, very, very niche industry that actually they genuinely struggled to recruit into these particular roles. So for them, it was difficult to agree with flexible working requests because they just could not recruit. It had taken them 18 months to 2 years to recruit a particular person. So again, it depends on the nature of your business. It depends on the size of the team, etc. Detrimental impact on quality. People do try to use that one quite a lot. I think you need to be a little bit careful with that one. Detrimental impact on performance, insufficiency of work during the periods the employee proposes to work. Well, let's use a really obvious example, which again I have had, whereby an employee wanted to work basically evenings and sort of late into the evening, let's say. It wasn't quite overnight. The client's business wasn't open, so there was nothing to be doing. There was no sort of shelf stacking or anything else, and obviously you have to bear in mind what they're actually employed to be doing anyway. But actually, if their role is to be answering telephone, for example, and the telephone lines are shut at that time, then there's no need to have them at that time. And then obviously any planned structural changes. So there are 8 grounds there, and the request must fall within one of those 8. Now, obviously, just touching on what Becky's already said, if you do agree to the flexible working request, then you need to confirm that by way of a letter. And I would also, therefore, amend their contract as well. So you can either reissue an entirely new contract, which you don't have to do that, and it does seem a lot of work when it's maybe not necessary. It's up to you, obviously, but more usually you would issue an addendum letter, and you need to be very clear on what's changing. So it's not just the hours or the pay, for example. It would also be holiday entitlements, and if there's anything else which is also changing as a result of it as well. So do be careful that you do actually, when you are amending somebody's terms and conditions, that you are amending all of them and not simply the hours. I have seen clients just amend the hours and not actually amend the pay and everything else that goes with it. And then, as Becky said, although the employee is the one that's made the request and you're agreeing to it, do make sure that they do sign to confirm their agreement to the change. That's really important. Okay, and then just the next one, please, Zoe. So, in light of, got the sorry,
there we go.
there we go. So, just in anticipation that there might be several requests landing on your desks. Perhaps you've already had an avalanche of them. Perhaps you haven't had any at all yet. I have had questions already about, look, I've had 3 or 4 or 5, we've got a small team, how do we deal with them? Obviously, there's flexible working requests under the statutory schemes, then they do need to be dealt with properly in accordance with the statutory scheme, as we've already outlined. They should be considered on individual merit, and they should be considered on a first come, first served basis, effectively, so the order in which they're actually received. Obviously, it's up to you practically as an organisation. You know your staff, you know your team. You know whether it might be feasible to have a discussion amongst everybody. Of course, being careful, because of course everyone's flexible working requests is actually confidential, but whether it's possible to actually have a conversation with all of your team to try and iron out who wants what and how you can actually accommodate everybody. As I say, from the statutory, I do obviously as a lawyer have to say that you have to comply with the statutory scheme, but practically you may be able to deal with everybody's and reach an agreement with everybody that keeps your team happy. If that's not something, then you obviously need to make sure that you are dealing with them in the order which they come in. The overriding requirement is to deal with requests in a reasonable and consistent manner. So you do also just be careful that even if you know, look, I'm going to get a request of somebody else and I want to agree theirs because, I don't know, they've got childcare or something, but I've already got these 4, but you can't reject these 4 unless it falls into one of the 8 grounds on the basis, well, I know I'm going to be getting another request. That wouldn't be reasonable, wouldn't be consistent either. In terms of, so that's obviously under the statutory scheme, but there is nothing stopping an organisation dealing with, I call them informal requests. So obviously if an employee hasn't got the 26 weeks continuous length of service, then they actually legally aren't entitled to make a flexible working request. If an employee has already made a request that, let's say, has been granted, it doesn't matter whether it's been granted or not granted, but they made a flexible working request, I don't know, 3 months ago, 4 months ago, and they want to make another one, under the scheme, they're not entitled to, because they need to wait, because they'll be making more than one within the 12-month period. You as an organisation may take a view that actually you would like to deal with these requests. Would advise you to just be a little bit cautious. If you start dealing with more than one request in the 12-month period, you have to make sure that you're being consistent. So you could end up with lots of people making lots of requests within the 12-month period, and then you're having to justify why you're dealing with some and you're refusing to deal with others. But there might sometimes be circumstances whereby you feel that it's only fair. So for example, I don't know, if somebody's made a request because they wanted to reduce their hours, let's say, because they had a child, and unfortunately they no longer have that child for one reason or another, and therefore they would like to return to full-time work, you might decide that that's actually a bit of an unusual situation, and that you're willing to allow an extra request to be made and to be considered, because there's, you know, exceptional circumstances. Don't have to be exceptional circumstances, but you might just want to take a view on a case-by-case basis. You also need to just be a little bit careful, because of course there are statutory protections. So if somebody is making a request for I don't know, childcare, for example, and they're under the 26 weeks and they've got a disability and they've only been employed with you for a couple of weeks, then if you don't consider their request, then that could give rise to discrimination claims. Obviously, in a statutory scheme, they would be entitled to, because they haven't got the length of service. But if you don't deal with the request, then that could be opening you up to discrimination claims. So basically, ensure that you are being consistent and fair. And then very finally, I'm not going to go into any detail whatsoever in respect of claims, but just to make you aware that, as I've already said, it's whether we're talking about the statutory flexible working request or whether we're talking about an informal flexible working request, just make sure that you deal with everybody fairly. So consider everything you know, in a fair and consistent manner, because it can give rise to sex discrimination claims, disability discrimination claims, possibly religion or belief discrimination, and constructive dismissal, of course. So if they've got over 2 years length of service and you've refused to request, then it can give rise, if they can't continue working or they feel that you've breached their contract, it can give rise to a constructive dismissal claim as well. As long as you follow the process, you can justify your actions, particularly your refusal, if that's the case, then that will obviously put you in better stead for defending any claims. But hopefully that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through that, but hopefully that's been of some interest to you. So I'm going to pass over to Claire, who is going to, I think, be discussing really interesting points about policies, which I'll be interested to know whether many people have actually given any consideration to this. So over to Claire.
Thanks, Nikki. Hi, everyone. I'm Claire, and I'm an employment solicitor at Price Bailey. So I'm going to look at policies and procedures, because it's important that, as well as updating your contracts of employment, that you also ensure that your policies reflect your current working practices. So to date, many employers will have been working or enabled employees to work from home on an emergency basis. But as we're coming out of lockdown now, and the message from the government is to encourage everybody to work from home wherever possible, it is now that employers are going to seek to regulise home working and hybrid working arrangements. And it's important that you have policies and procedures in place in relation to this. So you will need to address a number of practical issues in relation to home working or hybrid policies, depending on which route or whether you go down both routes. So I just wanted to highlight a few points that you need to take into account. So the first one is to make sure you take appropriate measures to protect confidential information and personal data. So both home workers and hybrid workers will need specific training on their obligations regarding data protection and confidentiality. This will include updating them or giving them training on any procedures that they must follow, and making it clear what is and what is not classified as authorised use of data. Now, the Information Commissioner's Office has produced guidance to help you to comply with data protection law while working from home, and it has advised that you undertake a data privacy impact assessment. which highlights a number of things that you just need to consider and work out how you're going to address. For example, whilst working from home, who will have access to the employee's computer and the personal data stored on it? Will there be security measures in place to ensure that no other members of the household will have access to that personal data? Will there be, what other sorts of security will there be? Have you considered having, making sure that individuals change their passwords regularly and that they shut down their computer when they're not working or leave the room, for example? You also need to consider what the situation would be if they left the premises for a long period of time. For example, how is everything secured and is it to your satisfaction? You also need to have a think about paper files. For example, where are they going to be kept? Should they be kept in a secure filing cabinet? And if so, are you going to provide that filing cabinet? Also, what are the rules for any paper documentation that there are in relation to destruction? Will you provide a shredding machine, or would they be required to take those documents into the office to be destroyed confidentially at that point? And have staff been given any training guidance as to remind them continuously about how to protect that personal data? It is important that as things become the norm now, that we just revisit these policies and see if there's any training that needs to be given to ensure everyone understands their responsibilities. So the next thing you just need to bear in mind is any health and safety implications from working from home and carrying out a risk assessment. So employers do have a common law and statutory duty regarding health and, there's a fly on my screen, health and safety of employees in the working. So this includes both mental and physical health. So if employers are going to put in place more permanent home working or hybrid working arrangements, you will need to revisit health and safety risk assessments that were carried out as part of the initial home working during the COVID outbreak, as there will be a different consideration where home working has been allowed on a temporary basis compared to a permanent one. So when looking at health and safety, there are a number of factors to consider. The first one is stress and mental health. So some employees working from home will find it very difficult to put in place boundaries between work and home life, especially as their computer may be in their kitchen or dining room table. It's very difficult sometimes for people to switch off, which can lead to increased stress. It's therefore crucial to try and introduce some boundaries and ensure that they do take adequate rest breaks. You also need to be aware that contact between home workers and their colleagues is likely to be less frequent, which will make supervision of work practically more challenging for managers. Those working from home may become isolated and lack those support networks available to those that are compared to those that are in the workplace. So you just need to be mindful of how things are going to work, making sure there is adequate supervision in place. Think about how to monitor the hours that people are working, the stress levels, and incorporate home workers into the team as far as possible. Other health considerations include first aid. So an employer must provide appropriate first aid provisions and supplies to all employees, and that does include anybody working from home. But the precise requirements will depend on their work and the risks involved. So most home working would be low risk and should not create any problems. So a simple first aid kit would be sufficient. You also need to consider accidents. So a serious accident or injury in work must be reported to the employer whenever it occurs. So you just need to think about a proper reporting procedure to allow home workers and hybrid workers to report accidents and actually to make those individuals aware what the requirements are, because individuals may not be aware that they have to report anything to you because they are at home. The other thing to bear in mind is workstations that individuals are working from, and to make sure that you comply with any health and safety display screen equipment regulations, which means that you just need to have a review of both the equipment that people are using and also the environment that they're working in. You just need to, or the regulations set out requirements regarding breaks and changes in activity, covers eye tests and the provision of training and provision of information. So you will need at some point to carry out a workplace assessment, whether that's by sending a questionnaire initially to employees to complete. The next important heading or points that you need to cover within a policy is looking at whether you need to provide any special equipment. So there is no legal obligation to provide equipment for home working or hybrid working, but you should ensure that you comply with any duties you have towards any particular individuals. For example, if anyone did have a disability, then you would have to provide equipment which may be considered a reasonable adjustment. But disabled employees can access a scheme called the Access to Work, which does provide a grant for special equipment. So if you were struggling to afford anything, it may be covered by this grant. So whilst you don't need to provide any equipment, a lot of employers will look to provide their own equipment just because they can ensure the security of the access to the system and ensure that the necessary virus protection is on there. It's also suggested that if individuals have to do more than minimum phone calls, that a dedicated mobile is provided for work use. This will ensure that confidential information remains on a company device and also that you can put the correct software on it. Steps should be taken to ensure that individuals know how to install antivirus protection and software updates to make sure that their information to make sure everything is kept up to date. There's also insurance requirements, or at least you need to have a think about insurance and planning. So whilst working from home won't normally require any specific planning permission, in the event that down the line, for example, structural alterations are made to the business, or if it is used for wider purposes such as business meetings or visitors coming on site, then planning permission may be required. So employees just have to look at their deeds to see whether anything further needs to be taken. There would generally be no obligation on the employer to fund this unless it's stated in the contract. Likewise, with insurance, the company or the employer should look to cover any equipment provided under the employer's insurance scheme. If that's not possible, then the individual will have to provide that insurance. And it may be that the parties agree that the employer would cover that cost via a reimbursement. And also, you just need to think about, so they're more the practical side from equipment and confidential information, data protection, things that maybe we haven't updated over the last 18 months just because it was an emergency situation. But as things calm down, it is sensible to look at the policies and what you expect from your employees moving forward. It is also important to think about how you are going to manage and supervise home workers moving forward, and how you're going to measure quality and quantity in relation to their output. You have to think about maybe having a suitable reporting system, how you're going to appraise individuals, how you're going to involve them in different projects and performance, because obviously you may have situations where you'll have part of the team in the office and part of the team out the office. So you need to look at how you can manage that moving forward. It is particularly important as you or home workers or hybrid workers should not be denied any promotional prospects. It may be that those in the office are offered a promotion, but it needs to be able to be objectively justified to avoid any discrimination claims being brought. And finally, in terms of working from home or hybrid working, you will need to consider tax consequences, as an employee may be entitled to claim a deduction against taxable income for certain household expenses, but conversely may not be able to claim certain travel costs in the way that they previously did as a purely work-based worker. So it's best that you have a look at your expenses policy and take some advice from a tax specialist. I'm conscious of time, but we're nearly there. So as well as looking at home working and hybrid policies, there are some other policies that you'll need to update or consider updating or refreshing moving forward. First one being your sickness, absence and pay policy. So over the last 18 months, you may have adjusted your notification evidence requirements in relation to COVID-related absences, for example, where people are required to self-isolate, where they don't actually have any symptoms themselves, and you may have clarified what the sick pay entitlement is during that period of time, especially in relation to statutory sick pay. So you may want to update these policies, or alternatively, you could have a separate COVID policy to address these issues, as it's hoped, fingers crossed, that these won't be long-term changes. So you could have a policy that can easily be removed once things settle down a bit more. Completely up to you how you address it, but employees will need to know what the requirements are. Another policy you will need to review is your disciplinary rules and procedure, as it may be appropriate to include under disciplinary rules, or as an act of misconduct, is failure to observe social distancing and any other measures to protect infection. So that could be included as a misconduct issue and something to make your employees aware of. Another policy to revisit is your harassment and bullying policy. So there is a potential moving forward that employees may be harassed by colleagues or customers in the workplace because they are perceived to be at greater risk of having the virus. So you may consider a return to work or to the workplace, or having, as we're now looking forward, have in place or to do some training about anti-harassment and bullying and what you expect in the workplace and the conduct that is unacceptable. You should also look at your holiday pay policy or holiday policy. As obviously restrictions now be lifted, it is more likely that a number of employees are all going to make a request for holiday at the same time. You need to consider practical issues in the workplace as how you're actually going to deal with this. You may want to remind employees of what the procedure is in relation to holiday requests and how many people can have holiday off at one time. Hopefully it can all be worked together, but it'd be a useful time to remind people what the procedure is. You'll also, as I've already mentioned about confidential information and data protection, you will want to update your IT and communication systems policy, especially if people are working from home, as your current policy may not adequately address issues such as data security and also social media use. And the final one is in relation to monitoring. If there's going to be a change in the way that you monitor how individuals work or have different software because people are working from home, you do need to inform employees of any change. And finally, in relation to policies and procedures, if your policies are non-contractual, then all you need to do is inform employees that the handbook's been updated and let them know what their changes are. But if your policies and procedures are contractual, then you will need to seek agreement of all employees to any changes. Sorry, that's a bit of a whirlwind tour, as I am conscious of at the time. Just wondered, has anyone got any questions generally in relation to any of the topics we have covered? Either put it in the box or feel free to ask.
Yeah, I've had a few questions come into a chat box directly to me, because I don't think there's a function to send to all hosts, unfortunately. I think I've just realised as I've got quite a few questions. I don't think we'll have time to get through all of them, but let me just pick up on a couple, and I'm actually just going to pick up on a couple with you, Claire, because it makes sense as you've just spoken. So one question is, oh, where's the chat box gone? Okay, so the chat box is on my other screen. Let me just find the question then where it has gone to. So just bear with me. I had popped the chat box on the other screen to make it a lot easier for me to read. One question, obviously I'm not going to name anyone because they come through, so people probably don't want to be named. If it is the employee that is requesting to work from home and not the employer, is the employer still obliged to provide first aid kits, appropriate workstations, chairs, etc.? Does that, I'm not sure whether that actually does fall completely into your camp there, Claire, but I don't know if you want to.
I would say yes, because it's still an agreement that the individual will be working from home, so the employer still has the same obligations, whether or not it's the employee's request or the employer's request.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Somebody asked this about first aid kits the other day, and I know a lawyer that said, no, there is no requirement to provide a first aid kit at home, but I thought I had read somewhere in the last week or two that there was a requirement. So I'm not 100% sure on that, I've got to be honest with you, but I'm very happy to have a look into it and we can come back to you on that. Somebody else has asked, is it okay to be worried about the loss of teamwork with working from home requests as an employer? Not exactly sure whether that means the loss of teamwork because people aren't happy about the requests not being granted, or I'm not entirely sure. My view would be that as an employer, I wouldn't want there to be any loss of teamwork. I would very much, I think as an employer, want my team to gel. They tend to work better, you get better output. That's generally what you want from your staff. Don't know if anyone else has got a different view on that.
Well, that's, I suppose, how you try and make hybrid work for you as a business, and not just, I suppose, the individual, is to, you've still got to have that time for teamwork, but allow people to work from home at certain points, but it's coming to that arrangement that works for everyone, which is not going to be straightforward, and it's something that probably have to be worked out over time.
Yeah. There is another one, I think this is for you, Becky, actually. If all employees in the team agree to a change of hours and agree for the change to be implemented quicker than the notice, can the changes be implemented quicker, or do we still have to give them full notice?
I think you could probably agree. If everybody agrees, then I see no reason why you couldn't do it as soon as everybody agrees. Yeah, because they're just agreeing to vary the notice provisions. So I think that would be fine. I think also your risk of it would be incredibly low as well. There was another one I think that came into the general chat, actually. Shall I just pick that up while I'm here? Which was to do with contract of employment, changing job descriptions. Where's the boundary between a job description and an employment contract? But I suppose it is slightly arbitrary. You do sometimes see a job description annexed to the employment contract, and so in those ways I suppose it is contractual. Normally a job description is probably not so quite rigid and contractual. The issue, if you're going to change somebody's job description, it is, I suppose it's a question of factor and degree, really, because if it's changing significantly, you could be in a redundancy type situation if the job is really quite different to what they had before. If you're looking to perhaps just tweak some elements of the duties that they do, it's unlikely to be a significant change. But I think you need to be mindful of that.
Yeah. I'm really conscious of the time because it's 11 o'clock. So, and I know that we've still got some other questions, but we're not going to have time to get through all of them. I think what I'd say is if anyone's got any particular burning questions which they'd like answering, maybe just drop us an email, either myself, Becky or Claire. Just feel free to drop us an email. Our details will be on the slides, which are going to be forwarded to everybody afterwards. I should have said that at the very beginning, my apologies. You will also get obviously a copy of the recording as well. So feel free just to drop us a message and we will very happily answer. Some of the questions that have come through are quite specific, to be honest with you. So we'll not be able to, I don't think, even give a generic answer because we need a little bit more information on a couple of these. But unless if anyone else has got anything to say, I will just therefore take the opportunity to thank everybody for attending today. Thank you ever so much. Thank you to the Chamber for having us. Thank you to the speakers, and I'm not necessarily thanking myself there, by the way, but thank you to Becky and to Claire for giving up your time. We have got another session, a HR bite-sized session. That's going to be on the 5th of August, but somebody will correct me if I'm wrong on that date. And that's going to be considering the practical and commercial implications of adopting flexible working in the workplace. And that is also going to, I believe, we're going to have a very exciting guest speaker. So keep your eyes peeled as to who that's going to be. So unless anybody else has got anything to say?
No, just the poll's on screen at the minute. So if you have got a minute, if you can just complete that, please.
That would be fantastic. Obviously, I'm happy to have any feedback, any ways to improve, or say any particular topics that you would like to hear about. But thank you all very, very much. Hopefully you found it helpful or useful. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye.